All right, good morning, boys and girls. Once again, welcome to the Broken Blade. So now we're on chapter 4. It's called Departure. So we have Pierre's dad, who's got injured. So Pierre decided to step in for him. So he signed on as a voyageur. He signed his engagement papers. Those are basically what those are. That means that basically you're signing on to do a job. Okay, so he signed on to be a voyageur. And there are different types of voyageurs. And the type of voyageur that Pierre has signed on to be, I don't want to go ahead and give away too much stuff here, but he signed on to be a voyageur for just a few months, okay, for the year. So his job is to paddle from Montreal, Canada, up this river, our river, down this lake, over on the Lake Superior, and over here to Grand Portage, or Grand Portage, which is now in Minnesota. Remember, at this time, Minnesota as a state did not exist. So this is Pierre's route. At the top of every chapter, you'll see that. So it's going to take him approximately 3 months out and back. So remember what he's gotten, what he has received. Sorry about that. What he has received is part of his pay for the trip. The company, the Northwest Company, whom he works for, has given him 1/3 of his pay. And he hasn't even departed yet. So, wow, that's a big deal. And keep in mind, the guy's only 13 years of age. And he's working with men who are experienced. And he has no experience. He's talked himself into this job. Wonder how it's going to work out. What do you say we find out? So, on Wednesday, Pierre stopped by the school to say goodbye. It was recess. And he was the center of attention. Oh, whose brigade are you in? When do you leave? How many miles will you paddle? As Pierre answered the questions, his eyes searched the schoolyard for Celeste Gallard. When Pierre finally saw her, standing at the rear entrance with her friends, recess was nearly over. As he stepped away from the boys, Celeste waved. By the time Pierre crossed the schoolyard and reached her side, Sister Marguerite was ringing the bell. I apologize for my system here of holding the book down, but the best I can do here, sports fans. Thanks for being patient with me. So, Celeste's two friends giggled a moment, then left them alone. So I hear you're headed north, she said. Pierre wanted to say something clever, something she would remember during the long summer while he was gone. But all he could manage was, yes. Isn't that an awfully long paddle? Well, it's 2,400 miles, Pierre replied. He wanted to say more, but the yard was nearly empty, and she was turning to leave. Pierre the thinker, Pierre the bookworm, was mumbling away his last chance. You know how Sister is about tardiness, Celeste said as she started up the steps. This was his last chance. Pierre reached out to touch her hand, and when she turned, he decided to risk it. If he had the courage to sign up for a 2,000-mile canoe trip, he should have the nerve to kiss a pretty girl. His aim was imperfect, but he managed to graze her lips. Then, to his surprise, she gave him a quick kiss in return. Celeste's eyes were bright, and her cheeks were flushed as she ran up the steps, calling out one last goodbye. For a moment, Pierre stood alone in the empty yard, almost wishing he could step back into the comfortable world of reading and recitations. Oh, be good, Mother said as she leaned forward and gave her son a quick peck on the cheek. Pierre nodded and took one last look at his little sister, who was nestled in Camille's arms, half asleep. "You take care of your sister," Pierre whispered, tickling Claire's chin until she smiled. Then Pierre turned to shake his father's hand one last time. Without thinking, Father claps Pierre on the back, and with his injured hand, Father clapped Pierre on the back with his injured hand and cursed at the sudden pain. Pierre looked concerned, but Father laughed and waved his bandage toward Mother. "Don't worry. Your mother will take care of me. You watch your backside and keep your powder dry." Up and down the shore of the St. Lawrence, families gathered as all 5 Montreal canoes were checked one last time. Pierre was sorry La Petite wasn't one of his 14 canoe mates, but his father's old friend Charbonneau was the steersman. And a grinning, white-haired man they called Lalande manned the bow. Bows in the front, steersman's in the back. Pierre recognized one of his fellow middlemen, a young man named Emile Duval, who had left school only last year. Pierre was glad to see the scarred man Bellegarde walk toward another canoe. The voyageurs paddled in their finest breechclouts, shirts, and sashes. They all wore new moccasins and elegantly plumed red caps. The 40-foot canoes were moored in the shallows, already loaded with a winter's worth of trade goods. The gunwales of each birch bark craft were painted with bright stripes, and Northwest Company decorated each bow. Flags hung from the stern poles. Flags hung from the stern poles, and vermilion-tipped paddles stood propped in each craft. All right, vermilion is a red-colored dye that was popular during the time of the fur trade. It would be used to dye clothing, blankets, or in this case, they use it also as a paint. McKay, dressed in buckskin like an ordinary crewman, nodded to Charbonneau, and the boarding began. As Bellois stepped past McKay, he pointed to Pierre and said, "If that puppy is coming with us, I hope you check to see that it is housebroken." The fuelman chuckled as Bellois cackled and slapped his thigh. Pierre's eyes burned. He hoped his father hadn't heard. He waded into the icy water up to his knees and stepped carefully into the canoe he would be paddling for the next 12 weeks. Okay, what is that? 12 weeks? 3 months, right, boys and girls? He knew from his father how fragile these Montreal canoes were. Though they carried 2.5 tons. 2.5 tons. Holy cow, that's a lot of weight. Though they carried 2.5 tons of freight, their birch bark skin demanded care in boarding and required the men to sit still as they paddled. Remember, birch bark, just like I showed you from the classroom. Too much shifting of weight strained the laced root and gummed construction. Once the trade goods were delivered to the fort at Grand Portage, the company sometimes purchased new canoes to carry their valuable cargo of furs home at summer's end. The other night, Father explained, "Rough handling means days lost in repairs, and lost days is lost dollars to the Northwest." Pierre took his place among the 12 middlemen in his canoe. So we got 12 middlemen, plus the bowsman and the steersman. So we got 14 people in each canoe. 2.5 tons of freight. All right. How much weight's in a ton? 2,000 pounds, right? So we're looking at 5,000 pounds of freight. That's 2.5 tons. 5,000 pounds of freight and 14 people, all being held together by flimsy birch bark. Yikes. Pierre took his place among the 12 middlemen in his canoe. Someone on the bank fired a pistol, and the crowd cheered. As the men around him shouted farewells, Pierre waved his cap toward his family and called, "Goodbye!" His stomach sank at how final that word sounded this morning. Charbonneau pushed the stern of Pierre's canoe clear of the shallows. "To the north!" he called, and the bowsman Lalande let out a whistle from his post, and he waved his paddle overhead. Without another word, the men suddenly dipped their paddles in unison. Struggling to catch up, Pierre grabbed his blade and pulled hard. Of course, if you haven't figured it out yet, the word blade is another name for the paddle. There was a whirl of color as 6 paddles turned the river to froth. As the canoe started up the river, Pierre's dog Pepper and a few other dogs ran along the shore, barking. Every year, the first miles proved who had the fastest canoe. As long as they were within sight of shore, the men would pull for all they were worth. Charbonneau's canoe held its position in the middle of the brigade until they were a quarter of a mile out. Then the fourth canoe crept past. Pierre tried to keep up with the windmilling blades around him. He prayed they could hold off the last canoe until they rounded the southern tip of Lachine and passed the crowd's view. Pierre knew his father was watching from shore. Each spring, father studied the first brigades to depart. He always scorned the last canoe as a sad excuse for canoemen. La Petite was chanting an old French song from the stern of the trailing craft. "Row, brothers, row," he said. He sang, "The river runs fast, the daylight fades fast." Pierre knew that good singers were prized as voyageurs. A lively little middleman named Miguel Lercoq helped the bowman Lalande lead the same chant in Pierre's canoe. "Put your backs into it," Charbonneau commanded. "Give it all you got, fellows," Lalande sang out in a voice rich and loud like Pierre's father's. Pierre paddled as hard as he could. He knew they would blame him as the youngest member of the crew if they fell behind. Studying Emile, who was sitting right in front of him, Pierre leaned forward with each stroke and jerked back hard, trying to match his pace. They kept up until Charbonneau turned his canoe around the southernmost point of Lachine. There, La Petite cut between them and the shore. As he glided past, he called, "Paddle, Grandpa, paddle," and laughed. "You'll not get home before the frost if you drag your blade that slow." The men in both canoes joined in on the fun. "Grandpa?" Charbonneau echoed. "That's a good one." Pierre's face, flushed from exertion, reddened even more. He swallowed his anger and pulled fierce and deep on his paddle. An hour later, the canoes had settled down to a moderate pace, but Pierre's arms were aching. His back was sore, and his hair was plastered to his temples with sweat. How could he ever paddle 2,400 miles? His father warned him, too, that poor weather could extend the 12-week trip by a month or more. To break the monotony, he counted his strokes. 1, 2, 3. He silently marked each pull. At first it took his mind off the pain, but by the time he got to 500, he knew he'd made a mistake. Pierre glanced over his shoulder, amazed how slowly they were moving. He could run that far in 5 minutes. To cheer the men on, Lalande and Michel Lercoq started up another song. But Pierre didn't listen. He counted instead. When he got to his 1,000th stroke, he refused to look back, and by the time he reached 2,000, he realized it was taking as much effort to count as it was to paddle. But he kept at it just the same. Just to prove that he could, he would count this day through to the end. Pierre thought back in school. recalling how he could balance a quill pen on the back of one finger and feel no weight. Right now, he would trade places with anyone in the classroom. Pierre was a boy who liked to curl up with a book and ponder and dream. But he could already see there would be no time for dreaming in this life. Lift, pull, lift, pull. 25, 26, 20. His paddle felt like iron. As Pierre labored, he recalled a poem that Sister had him memorize last month, telling the story of a hero called Aeneas who was cursed by the gods. The poem began, arms and the man I sing, who forced by fate and haughty Juno's unrelenting hate, expelled and exiled, left the Trojan shore, long labors both by sea and land he bore. When Pierre thought about the many years Aeneas wandered after the Trojan War, he was ashamed to be exhausted only after a single morning of paddling. Demi-charge! The steersman yelled. Pierre looked up. They were at the base of a short rapids and had to paddle double time against the current. I said demi-charge! Charbonneau shouted, tipping Pierre's cap off with his long setting pole. The men laughed as Pierre ducked to grab his cap. Though the current was swift, it was no match for their paddles. The moss-crowned rocks blurred beneath the white hull as Charbonneau chanted in military cadence, pull, pull, pull! Out of the corner of his eye, Pierre saw the muscles stand out on Charbonneau's forearms as he planted his setting pole and pushed hard. At the top of the short cascade, Lalande shouted, hard now! And pulled double time with his paddle. The bow rose and then fell as the canoe cut through the white funnel at the head of the rapids and glided into a still pool. Well done, gentlemen, said Lalande. 6 middlemen cheered and waved their paddles. Pierre knew if a canoe could be paddled up a rapids or pulled up with tracking ropes, the crew had reason to celebrate. There was no harder job than portaging their 90-pound bales around the places in the river that were too dangerous to paddle. Smart voyageurs would gladly paddle 5 miles out of their way to avoid even a half-mile carry. All right, boys and girls, portaging here means to carry. A portage is when you literally have to get out of the canoe, you unload 5,000 pounds of freight, and you put it on your back and you walk it. Now, that is a major, major amount of work. And like he said, you did your best to avoid it, but you're under rules. The company tells you you're not allowed to go down rapids. You're not allowed to shoot rapids at all, because what could happen? Well, the canoe could capsize and all the freight would fall out into the river and be lost. Now, is it possible the people would drown? Sure. But unfortunately, and this is going to sound cruel, but it's true, the Northwest Company, as well as the other company, Hudson's Bay Company, did not care about the men. What they cared about was the freight. Yeah, pretty bad, isn't it? So at the head of the pool stood a little stone church of St. Anne, the patron saint of the voyageurs. Pierre's father often spoke of this place. Here, Northwest traders and explorers paused to ask a blessing for the journeys. Suddenly, the cheering crewmen went silent. Still gasping for breath from this hard paddling, Pierre looked up to see the men in the lead canoe take their caps off all at once. A lone canoe approached the landing below the church, carrying a wooden coffin. Emile asked Charbonneau, "Is that Bourgogne?" Charbonneau nodded. "One more cross for the Calumet." Pierre had heard of the famous crosses that marked the graves of voyageurs who died en route. His name was Emile Bourgon. Charbonneau continued. He drowned in the upper Ottawa just before freeze-up. His crewmen just dug his body out of its winter grave. Though the day was warm, Pierre shivered at the thought of a body lying frozen beneath the snow. He imagined foxes and wolves pawing at the piled stones of the cairn, and mice seeking shelter in the corpse's pockets. After the canoe and coffin passed, the men stopped by the Church of St. Anne to make an offering. Pierre's arms ached as he stepped ashore. Pierre's arms ached as he stepped ashore. One by one, they deposited their coins in the box at the front of the chapel and stepped inside to cross themselves and whisper a prayer. Even Mr. McKay dropped some money into the box. Yeah, try and fix this a little bit. That looks kind of... There we go. Later, the men lit clay pipes and sat quietly at the river's edge. A few walked off to be alone. This place marked the official beginning of their journey, yet no one looked north. Pierre stared at the dark green hills that lay upriver, wondering what they held. When he finally turned his eyes toward home, his throat went tight. Father should be here, not me, he thought. He closed his eyes and he saw the flash of the blade and the blood, and he saw the doctor reach for the black thread and bright needle. 100 times he played that scene over in his mind, and it was always the same. He felt shame in his laziness and shame in knowing he wasn't brave enough to wish the stroke had fallen on his own hand instead. You ready to go? It was Emile Duval, his old schoolmate. Pierre nodded and stood up. Though Emile was 2 years older than Pierre, he'd been in the same grade. A tough farm boy. Emile wasn't stupid, but he often got behind by missing school during the planting and harvest seasons. Emile was known for his curly black hair, and he had a nervous habit of brushing his bangs away from his eyes. As they walked to the waiting canoes, Emile grinned. Paddling sure beats reciting those Latin poems at Sisters, don't it? Pierre smiled weakly, thinking just the opposite. Unless the paddling got a whole lot easier, he'd prefer Latin any day. Okay. How's it going for our buddy Pierre here? Is he doing good, or is he doing not so good? What do you think? All right. I hope you're enjoying this. I'm having a good time reading it to you, and we got more to come. So stand by.